Welcome back. Here with us on Urban Debate on Mirror Now, and joining us on the broadcast this evening is Mr Arvind Panagariya, former Vice Chairman, NITI Aayog and Professor, Columbia University. Sir, thank you very much for joining us here on Urban Debate. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Firstly, in one word, if I ask you to describe the budget, what will you say?
Prime Minister's budget. He speaks. He always says that development is for everybody, and this is a budget which is for development and therefore for everybody.
But it's being called as capitalist budget by many.
Well, capitalist budget is for everybody too. Just because it's capitalist doesn't mean capitalism lifts all boats. If you look at our own history, it is only after capitalism began to give us this 7-8% growth that a lot of the poverty was reduced. Before that, we had 4 decades of socialism, and that did really nothing for the poor.
But sir, the expectation was that since it's coming in the middle of the election season with, polls in UP also due, it's going to be more of an election budget. So the expectation was that, there could be some populist measures that could be announced. Are you disappointed with some of the announcements today, or you think it was overall a good budget?
I think it was a very good budget. There are a few things on which I can return, but just overall, my assessment is that this was a very good budget. There was the fear, indeed, for economists like us, that because of the elections, it may turn out to be a populist budget and full of giveaways. But quite remarkably, Heena, this is probably the first budget. I don't think this has ever happened in the past. That the entire budget speech is without references to giveaways to specific groups, right? There is always, every budget speech has, well, this is for the scheduled castes, this is for scheduled tribes, this is for the OBCs, this is for women, this is for the elderly, this is for, it doesn't do that. It's just, I think, the implicit view of the finance minister has been that, those schemes are there. And we are continuing with those. But ultimately, it is development which is for everybody. And so we are going to focus on development. And so she devoted much of her time speaking about infrastructure, urbanization, all sorts of connectivity, Gati Shakti, etc., rather than focus on specifically describing every single group. So this is, I think, very different in this sense. And it's a good thing because ultimately it is development which is going to deliver for us. It is, yeah.
So let's now look at the issues one by one, sir. Let's begin with the big takeaway from this budget, and that was about 35% or increase in our capital expenditure. 7.5 lakh crore is what government is now aiming to spend in the next financial year, much higher than what it was in the current financial year. How do you see that? And, because 1 lakh crore out of it is actually just going to states.
Yes, but it is on infrastructure. So don't forget that. So this is unprecedented, 2.9% of GDP on capital expenditure. Never happened before. And in 1 year, a hike of 35%. That's huge. That's one part of this. And the other is, of course, if you look at the track record of the government, it has been delivering on its infrastructure projects. Unlike in the past, particularly, last few years of the UPA, memories are short, so we forget this, but, the projects used to get stuck everywhere and, repeatedly years of delay. And so therefore, then the costs used to accumulate very heavily, the interest payments and all, and as a result, those projects suffered. But now, these projects are moving; they're being completed largely in the time-bound fashion. So this is therefore doubly productive investment. First it is productive because it is infrastructure, and therefore it facilitates the growth of the private sector. But secondly, it's also productive because the projects get delivered by the government. So I think this is a very important plank of the budget.
Okay, so second important issue that I want to talk to you about is the issue of disinvestment target. Now that number was also not mentioned by the finance minister during her budget speech. It came out later in the details in the documents that we saw later. But from 1,75,000 crore as the target that we had last year, it's come down to about 65,000 crore. How should we see this? Is it a more realistic target that the government has set, or we do not have enough assets now that we want to disinvest?
So on this one, I must say that I'm a little bit disappointed. I had, not only this 60,000 target is relatively low, but I was also kind of disappointed that there was no reference to privatization at all in the budget speech. Given the fact of farm laws having been reversed, so some bit of setback to reforms, there was at least in my view, some need to reinforce the resolve of the government towards reforms. And so, the lack of mention of privatization in general, but also no reference to the privatization of the two banks that had been put up for privatization earlier in the previous budget, and that has not happened. Leaves me a little bit concerned. Yes. So I see it not, I don't think there is any shortage of assets, because we know that easily there are 35 PSUs that have been identified for privatization. There is also a very large pipeline, some, 6 trillion rupees worth, or 6 lakh crore rupees worth of the assets, right? The roads and bridges, etc., for privatization. So it's also very surprising, Heena, that this is just the time that privatization seems to be gathering steam, because Air India was privatized. Then there was a second PSU, which was I'm forgetting the name for, which was privatized for about 200 crore rupees. And then 2 days ago, there was a third one, very large company, steel company, jointly owned by the government of Odisha and central government. I forget the name again, but it was purchased by Tata Steel for 12,000 crore rupees. So, just as the privatization program is actually gathering steam, I'm a little kind of surprised that the target has been slashed down to 60,000 crore rupees only.
Okay. Now, the third issue, sir, that I want to discuss with you is about jobs. Do you think the announcements that have been made, the allocation that has been made today for various projects is enough for the country to be able to generate jobs or create that environment for job creation?
So yeah, a good thing you mentioned both, the environment for job creation, because often people think that the government has to create all the jobs, but the government can directly create only so many jobs, through its expenditures. So on the direct job creation, I think the fact that so much money has been allocated to infrastructure projects is very good. Infrastructure building is a labor-intensive activity. It employs a lot of unskilled or low-skilled labor. So it really creates jobs where we have a lot of free labor available. A lot of people at the low end of the skill are looking for jobs. So that piece is exactly the right one. But for the rest of it, it has to be the environment that the budget creates, and also the policy framework. So I think policy-wise, a lot of the reforms got done. And so progressively, the policy environment is improving. And some of the labor law reforms, for example, are just now being implemented. About 22 states have now come up with their draft rules for implementing the labor code for industrial relations and for some of the other labor codes as well. So that's implementation is happening. One new thing that has been mentioned, and this will take me 1 or 2 minutes to explain. One new thing that has been mentioned in this budget, which is very important in my view, potentially if correctly done, is the announcement by the Finance Minister that the Special Economic Zones Act of 2005 will be replaced by a new law, new act. Now, if that act is designed properly, that actually has a huge potential for creating jobs. And this is where I need a minute to explain.
Okay.
That, what we need is the emergence of a lot of large-scale enterprises in the labor-intensive sectors like clothing industry, the apparel industry, the footwear industry, the furniture industry, a lot of light manufacturers, all sorts of things of daily use, things like umbrellas, kitchenware. All these are labor-intensive activities. We don't have enough large firms manufacturing these, but in the special economic zones, if we provide a good, flexible labor market regime, and we allow good transit of goods coming from abroad and going to abroad, meaning, customs clearance is very rapid. And so inputs and raw materials can be brought in quickly, processed, and then finished products can be made and shipped out quickly at relatively low costs. And particularly if that law also takes into account the fact that some of these special zones will have to be located in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, because a lot of these labor intensive industries operate on small margins, and therefore they actually have to operate in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So if all this is taken into account, this law is brought in, you can really globally become very competitive in large number of these industries from which China is exiting. Like apparel alone, China exports today $150 billion worth of apparel. If we take over that market because China is exiting from it, that could be a huge job creator. So that is the kind of thing that is there in the budget, which potentially can be very, very big winner.
Okay, since you did touch upon the issue of reforms, I want to ask you about reforms. No glamorous Big Bang reforms were really announced by the Finance Minister this time. Was that the expectation?
Well, you see, even before the budget, in the discussions that we are having on one of your sister channels, I had said this, that, by virtue of having done some of the big ticket reforms already in the previous budget, as you recall, the previous budget was full of announcements of reforms, and they all got done. They are still being implemented, but they got done. And that left relatively limited space for newer reforms. So one area where I think the announcement could have been made, but not in the budget, was free trade agreements. The government is doing those, and the economic survey speaks to that. It even says that, we are already, negotiations have been opened with the United Kingdom, and they're 90% done with Australia, and that we have also pretty much finished the negotiation with UAE, and they are also going to be happening with the European Union and Canada. So the economic survey says that. I had hoped that the budget will kind of both echo and reinforce that. That hasn't happened in the budget, but I still hope, that is still on. That is a big thing. If that happens, that will be very, very important. That will kind of reinforce the Special Economic Zones law. It will also reinforce our earlier reforms, the IBC, the GST, the labor law reforms, the corporate profit tax, which is now globally competitive. All those reforms will get leveraged by free trade agreements. So that's really the main thing. Now, for my list, I would have also wanted something on higher education. That was not there. That certainly is something that could have been announced, but unfortunately it wasn't there. Also, the two banks that I mentioned earlier on privatization, something on bank privatization needed to be said. So, yes, I think, on those fronts, I am a little bit disappointed.
Okay. The salaried class is also a little disappointed. Do you think nothing has been done for the middle class, the salaried class in this budget? Something could have been done given the fact how badly the pandemic impacted them. Income inequality is a concern too.
Well, that goes back to this whole issue of, trying to do something, a little bit of something for every single group. You can do it for middle class, but then we'll say, well, what, you haven't done anything for women, you haven't done anything for the elderly, you haven't done, I mean, there were a lot of demands, right, that give some sort of a higher interest payment on the savings of the seniors, specific exemptions, etc. But ultimately, look, it is a budget, right? So it's expenditure and tax revenues. Maybe budget requires revenues, and then you're spending. So how do you ultimately raise revenues if you are not going to be able to cut the expenditures? And there is also demand on the other hand for raising expenditures on all sorts of items. So somebody has got to pay the taxes.
I asked you this question about the salaried class. Yeah. Was to understand, because then, how are we then addressing the issue of demand, low demand, which is a concern, low purchasing power is a concern. Via the budget announcements today, how are we addressing these two issues along with rising inflation?
Look, demand, largely your weakness currently is in the private consumption demand. And a lot of the infrastructure spending will directly address that, because it will employ people and they will earn their wages and they will spend them. But you are also solving it indirectly by creating an environment for private investment to come in and private growth to happen. In the end, jobs will be created not just through infrastructure, but also through other economic activity that the investments by the private sector, which are currently quite robust, will create. And so that income will be spent. So, pandemic is not quite over yet, and we have just returned finally to the pre-COVID level of GDP, a little more than that, but not a whole lot more. So, there's 2 years of lost in a way in terms of no growth. If you look at the level of GDP today and 2 years ago, not a big difference, 1 or 2% is the only difference. And so private, the other demands have responded very robustly. They've come back, the government expenditure, the net exports, the investment. Only component is private consumption. And that simply just, is a matter of another 6 months to a year. It will come back roaring, because growth will continue. And now the growth that happens will be real growth in the sense that, it is on the base, which is not a low base. So we'll get that sort of 8-9% growth, and it's going to bring the consumption demand back. I don't think, remember that only 1.5 crore people pay the taxes. So if you really, even if you had cut their taxes, by 5 percentage points, which is a tough ask. But even if you did that, with 1.5 crore people paying those taxes and small cut in the their tax rates or giving some more exemptions, that's not going to be a big generator of demand. The big demand has to be generated by the masses. And for that, you need to actually employ the masses.
Okay. Are you satisfied with the kind of focus that has come for the health sector? Because like last year, there was a specific announcement for vaccination drive. 35,000 crore was earmarked. But this time, nothing really was mentioned in the budget. Is the pandemic over?
No. I think what I saw was an aggregate number, which is slightly higher than the last year's revised estimate.
Yes.
But how it is going to be
16%
spent,
higher, I
obviously.
guess.
Right. So how it is going to be spent has not been spelled out. At least I haven't seen it. But how can they end the, nobody in their right mind will even think of slowing down, let alone end the vaccine drive. So vaccine drive will continue. Your concern about health expenditures not rising enough is legitimate, but that ultimately comes down to the budget. How much revenues have you got and how much room you have. But we have at least done some good things. The vaccine drive is one of those, but also Ayushman Bharat, covering bottom 1/3 of the population for 5 lakh rupees per year, a family of 5. That's pretty good, actually. We should do more. Ultimately, if we can get to some sort of public provision of not provision, but coverage in which then the individuals can choose between private and public hospitals, just as they do currently under Ayushman Bharat, would be a good thing. But again, it's a matter of revenues, and having lost growth for 2 years now, the revenues are tight. So in another next 2 or 3 years, as we raise more and more revenues, growth happens, 7-8% kind of growth, that should ease up the budget constraint. And then, of course, health expenditure should be a very high priority.
Okay. And another point that I want to discuss with you, sir, is about achieving that 5 trillion economy goal by 2024-25. It was mentioned in the Eco Survey. A roadmap, in a way, was given about the kind of investment we are supposed to have in infrastructure over the next few years. But it wasn't really mentioned by the Finance Minister today.
So, yeah, I mean, look, we can't read too much in this speech itself directly because, ultimately it was 1.5 hours long speech, if I'm not mistaken. Not a very long speech. And so I'm sure they had to make decisions on what to include, what not to include. And a lot of things that we are saying, should have been there. Like I mentioned, the free trade agreements. Probably they're not there because they wanted to keep the speech to 1.5 hours only. But more substantively, getting to 5 trillion by 2024-25 now is a bit of a challenge. I have to say that because 2 years of growth has been lost to pandemic. 2 years later, we are where we were 2 years ago. So since we are starting there now again, at least 2 years, the target will have to move. But I sort of, don't think in terms of, a terminal target for in a particular year. My own kind of thinking is, can we bring back growth of about 7 to 8%? Let's try to push it to 9 or so. And for that, I think the budget makes the right moves. I think there's enough in the budget to go in that direction. Partly because, or very substantially, because a lot of the big ticket reforms that needed to be done have been done, and we need to keep implementing them. And that is a process that's underway. So I think we will get to sustained growth of about 7 to 8% over the next probably 2 decades. Again, it all depends on how the pandemic unfolds. If the pandemic forces more lockdowns, then of course that will have a negative impact. But assuming that the pandemic doesn't force any serious lockdowns, we are well on our way to sustain 7 to 8% growth, and for about a decade or two, we will be the fastest growing economy. So very soon,
Okay.
It may take a little longer, but we will soon be third largest economy in the world.
Okay. Okay, I just have 10 more seconds, sir, for you. One announcement that you were extremely disappointed with, something that you just didn't like.
Well, that's the increase in the tariffs. Once again, we have seen increases in the tariffs. That I think is a reversal of a path that we have chosen starting in 1991. So that's a little bit disappointing. It's not surprising. I think, that has been the government's policy. So it's consistent with what it has been doing.
All
but
right.
To me, as a trade economist, that's a disappointment.
All right, sir. Thank you very much for joining us here on Mirror Now and Urban Debate this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you, sir. With this, we will slip into another short break. There's lots lined up for you on the other side as well. Stay with us.